On the night she disappeared, Emily Parker sent a text message to her sister. The message contained only 6 words. "I finally found someone who cares." At the time, those words seemed harmless. Hopeful even. The kind of message family members love receiving after watching someone struggle through disappointment, heartbreak, and loneliness for far too long. Emily's sister smiled when she read it. She remembers that moment clearly. The relief. The optimism. The belief that Emily had finally found the happiness she had been searching for. What nobody realized was that those 6 words would eventually become one of the most discussed details in a story that would leave an entire community asking the same question. How could someone so intelligent, so careful, and so loved by the people around her become trapped inside a situation she never truly understood? 3 weeks later, everything changed. Phone calls started going unanswered. Messages remained unread. Family members became concerned. Friends began asking questions. And before long, investigators found themselves examining a relationship that appeared very different from the one Emily believed she was living. Because the deeper people looked, the more inconsistencies they found. Small things at first. Details that seemed insignificant on their own. A story that didn't quite match another story. A timeline that felt slightly off. Questions that never received clear answers. The sort of details people often dismiss because they don't seem important enough to matter. Until they do. Emily Parker believed she had found love. After years of disappointment, she believed she had finally met someone who understood her. Someone who listened. Someone who cared. Someone who seemed to arrive at exactly the right moment. Looking back, that's one of the reasons this story continues to resonate with so many people. Because almost everyone understands what it's like to want something badly enough that certain questions become easier to ignore. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The relationship appeared perfect from the outside. Friends saw happiness. Family members saw hope. Emily saw a future. But sometimes the most important details aren't the ones people notice immediately. Sometimes they're the details that only make sense after everything falls apart. The warning signs were there. The lies were there. The manipulation was there. Yet none of it looked obvious at the time. Because the most effective deception rarely arrives disguised as a threat. It arrives disguised as exactly what someone wants to believe. And by the time Emily Parker finally understood the truth, the consequences were already unfolding around her. What makes this story so unsettling isn't just what happened. It's how easily it could have happened to someone else. Someone intelligent. Someone cautious. Someone convinced they were making the right decision. So who was the man Emily Parker trusted? And what exactly was he hiding from the very beginning? At first glance, this looked like an ordinary love story. The kind of story people hear every day and rarely think twice about. A woman rebuilding her life after a difficult divorce. A successful man who appeared at exactly the right moment. A relationship that seemed to offer hope, stability, and the promise of a fresh start. If someone had described the situation to you in a few sentences, there would have been nothing unusual about it. Nothing alarming. Nothing that suggested investigators would eventually become involved. Nothing that hinted at the questions that would later surround both Emily Parker and Jason Reed. At 34 years old, Emily Parker had spent most of her adult life caring for other people. As a nurse, long shifts and demanding schedules were part of everyday life. Friends described her as compassionate, dependable, and resilient. But they also knew the previous few years had been difficult. Her marriage had ended after a painful divorce, leaving her with the challenge of rebuilding a future she once believed was secure. Like many people emerging from a major life change, Emily wasn't looking for perfection. She was simply looking for a reason to believe that happiness was still possible. Then Jason Reed entered her life. To almost everyone who met him, Jason seemed impressive. He was confident without appearing arrogant, successful without appearing boastful. He spoke comfortably with strangers, remembered details from conversations, and possessed the kind of charm that made people feel important. Friends who met him understood immediately why Emily was attracted to him. Family members who heard stories about him were cautiously optimistic. After everything Emily had been through, Jason appeared to be exactly the kind of person she deserved. That first impression would become one of the most important elements of the story. Because Jason Reed didn't just convince Emily. He convinced almost everyone around her. People liked him. People trusted him. People believed what he told them. And for a long time, there seemed to be no reason not to. Then there was Detective Megan Brooks. At the time Emily first met Jason, Detective Brooks had never heard either of their names. She had no reason to believe their lives would eventually become connected to an investigation that would force her to examine months of messages, records, timelines, and interviews. Yet as the story unfolded, Megan Brooks would find herself asking questions that nobody thought to ask when the relationship began. Who was Jason Reed really? Why did Emily trust him so completely? And what existed beneath the image he worked so hard to present to the world? Those questions seem obvious now, but they weren't obvious then. Because the relationship didn't begin with warning signs. It began with excitement, hope, attention, the feeling that something good had finally arrived after a long period of disappointment. Looking back, many people would later search for the exact moment everything started. The first mistake, the first lie, the first clue. But stories like this rarely begin with dramatic events. They begin with small decisions, small moments, small choices that seem completely harmless at the time. And in Emily's case, one of those moments almost never happened. Because before the dates, before the relationship, before Jason Reed became such an important part of her life, there was a message that arrived at an ordinary moment during an ordinary day, a message Emily nearly ignored. And if she had ignored it, the entire story might have unfolded very differently. To understand why Emily Parker trusted Jason Reed so completely, you have to understand where her life stood before he arrived. For nearly 2 years after her divorce, Emily focused almost entirely on work. Long shifts at the hospital filled most of her days, and when she wasn't working, she spent time with family, close friends, and the small routines that helped her rebuild a sense of stability. On the surface, she appeared strong. She handled responsibility well. She paid her bills, maintained friendships, and continued moving forward when many people would have struggled. But those closest to her knew there was another side to the story. Emily was lonely. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way she openly discussed. But loneliness has a way of settling quietly into a person's life. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it appears in the moments between responsibilities. The empty evenings. The holidays that feel different than they once did. The realization that everyone around you seems to be moving forward while you're still trying to put pieces back together. Emily wanted something many people want. A second chance. Not just at love. At happiness. At believing the future could still be better than the past. Then Jason Reed appeared. Exactly when she was beginning to wonder whether that future would ever arrive. The circumstances of their first meeting seemed almost ordinary. The kind of encounter people later describe as fate, coincidence, or perfect timing depending on what they choose to believe. What mattered wasn't where they met. What mattered was how quickly they connected. Conversation came easily. Laughter came naturally. Hours seemed to disappear whenever they were together. Jason possessed a quality many people found difficult to resist. He knew how to make people feel seen. When he spoke to someone, he appeared genuinely interested in what they had to say. He remembered details, asked thoughtful questions, paid attention in ways that made others feel important. For Emily, those qualities felt refreshing. For the first time in years, she felt understood. The relationship moved quickly. Phone calls became daily conversations. Daily conversations became regular dates. Regular dates became long weekends together. Within a relatively short period of time, Jason had become one of the most important people in her life. Friends noticed the difference immediately. Emily smiled more, laughed more, seemed lighter, more hopeful, more optimistic about the future. Several friends would later say the same thing. Emily hadn't smiled like that in years. From the outside, everything appeared positive. Jason seemed successful, confident, well-spoken. He dressed well, carried himself with confidence, and always appeared to know exactly what to say. Family members who met him generally liked him. Friends approved of him. Even people who were naturally cautious struggled to find anything obviously wrong. But as often happens in stories like this, the warning signs did not arrive all at once. They arrived gradually, small enough to ignore, subtle enough to explain away, easy enough to dismiss. The first involved Jason's past. Whenever conversations moved toward his earlier life, details remained surprisingly vague. He spoke comfortably about future plans, business goals, and current projects. But discussions about previous relationships, former friends, or certain periods of his life often ended quickly. If Emily asked questions, Jason usually provided answers. Yet those answers rarely contained much detail. At first, Emily assumed he valued privacy. Many people do. The explanation seemed reasonable. Then there were the stories. Nothing major. Nothing dramatic. Just small inconsistencies. Details that changed slightly depending on when they were discussed. A timeline that sounded different from a previous version. A location that didn't quite match something he had mentioned before. Each inconsistency seemed insignificant on its own. Most people probably wouldn't have noticed. And even when Emily noticed, she found reasonable explanations. People forget details. Memories aren't perfect. Misunderstandings happen. Again, everything seemed harmless. Then came the absences. There were occasions when Jason became unexpectedly unavailable. Calls went unanswered. Messages received delayed responses. Plans occasionally changed with little explanation. Whenever Emily asked about it, Jason always had an answer. Work emergency, unexpected travel, business issue, family obligation. The explanations sounded believable. And because she trusted him, she accepted them. That's often how trust works. Once we believe someone is honest, we naturally interpret uncertain situations in ways that protect that belief. People see what they want to see. And Emily Parker wanted to believe she had finally found the person she had been searching for. The person who cared. The person who understood her. The person who represented a fresh start. So she dismissed the concerns, ignored the inconsistencies, accepted the explanations, and continued moving forward. Until one evening, during what began as a completely ordinary conversation, something happened that neither Emily nor Jason could take back. A question was asked. An answer was given. And for the first time, Emily felt something she had never felt before. Doubt. Because that single conversation would eventually lead her toward a discovery that changed everything. The conversation that planted doubt in Emily Parker's mind did not end their relationship. In fact, for a short time, she convinced herself it had changed nothing. Jason Reed remained charming. Their routines continued. They still spoke every day. They still made plans for the future. From the outside, everything appeared normal. But something had shifted. Once doubt enters a relationship, even in the smallest amount, ordinary moments begin to feel different. Details that once passed unnoticed suddenly attract attention. Questions that never seemed important become difficult to ignore. And for Emily, that process began slowly before accelerating much faster than she expected. The first incident happened on a Monday evening. Emily was sitting in her apartment after a long hospital shift when Jason's phone rang while they were together. At first, neither of them paid much attention. But the moment Jason looked at the screen, something changed. His expression tightened almost instantly. It lasted only a second, yet Emily noticed it. Without answering the call in front of her, Jason stepped into another room. The conversation was brief, quiet. When he returned, he acted as though nothing unusual had happened. Emily asked who had called. Jason answered immediately. A business contact. Nothing important. The explanation sounded reasonable. Still, the reaction she had witnessed didn't match the answer he provided. For the first time, Emily made a mental note of something she otherwise would have forgotten. 2 days later, on Wednesday, another incident occurred. Jason suddenly announced that he needed to leave town for an unexpected business trip. Again, the explanation seemed believable. Successful professionals travel. Meetings arise unexpectedly. Schedules change. Yet something about the situation felt different. The details were vague. The destination seemed unclear. Questions received short answers. When Emily attempted to learn more, Jason quickly shifted the conversation toward other topics. Once again, she told herself she was overthinking things. But the doubt remained. By Friday, the uncertainty had grown stronger. That evening, Emily and Jason met for dinner. The conversation flowed easily, much like it always had. Then Jason casually mentioned an event from earlier in the week. At first, Emily barely noticed. Then she remembered something. The timeline didn't make sense. The story Jason was telling contradicted details he had previously shared. Not dramatically, not enough to prove anything, but enough to raise questions. When Emily pointed out the inconsistency, Jason laughed and corrected himself. The explanation arrived quickly and sounded completely reasonable. For a while, it worked. Emily accepted the answer, at least outwardly. But privately, she found herself replaying previous conversations in her mind. The phone call, the trip, the changing details, the absences, the unanswered questions. One by one, moments she had previously dismissed began resurfacing. The perfect relationship was beginning to crack. Not because Emily had discovered a major secret, not because she had uncovered evidence, but because the version of Jason Reed she trusted completely was no longer aligning perfectly with reality. Eventually, curiosity pushed her further than she originally intended to go. At first, she wasn't trying to investigate Jason. She was simply looking for reassurance. Something that would prove her concerns were unnecessary. Something that would allow her to return to the certainty she once felt. Instead, she found something else. One evening, while searching through publicly available information connected to Jason's professional life, Emily noticed a name she had never heard before. At first, it meant nothing, just another name among dozens of others. But the more she looked, the more unusual it seemed. The name appeared repeatedly, connected to places Jason had mentioned, connected to events he had attended, connected to timelines that overlapped with moments he claimed to be somewhere else. Then Emily found a photograph. The image wasn't hidden. It wasn't secret. In fact, it had existed in plain sight for quite some time. The reason she had never seen it before was simple. She never had a reason to look. The photograph showed Jason, standing beside a woman she didn't recognize. The two appeared comfortable together. Familiar. Close. Far closer than strangers would normally appear. Emily stared at the image for several minutes. Then she looked at the date. And everything changed. Because the date matched a period when Jason had told her he was somewhere entirely different. For the first time, Emily felt genuine fear. Not fear of danger. Fear of what the answer might be. The name. The photograph. The timeline. The connection she never knew existed. Suddenly, all of it pointed toward the same possibility. A possibility she desperately hoped wasn't true. But the more she examined the evidence, the harder it became to ignore. And that's when Emily realized she wasn't the only woman in Jason's life. The moment Emily Parker realized she wasn't the only woman in Jason Reed's life, the relationship changed forever. What disappeared wasn't simply trust. It was certainty. Until that point, Emily had still been searching for explanations that would allow the relationship to survive. She wanted misunderstandings, not revelations. She wanted clarification, not confirmation. But once she began connecting the pieces, she could no longer ignore the possibility that the man she thought she knew might be someone entirely different. What happened next was something Jason never anticipated. Emily stopped confronting him. She stopped asking direct questions. She stopped revealing what she knew. Instead, she became quiet. And in that silence, she began investigating. At first, the process seemed simple enough. Emily contacted people connected to Jason's past. Former colleagues, old acquaintances, individuals whose names appeared in conversations, records, and social media posts. She approached carefully, often asking casual questions that revealed more than she expected. What surprised her most was how inconsistent the answers became. Different people described different versions of Jason. Some stories aligned, others didn't. Certain timelines contradicted one another. Relationships Jason described one way were remembered very differently by other people. At first, Emily assumed she was dealing with misunderstandings. But as more information emerged, a disturbing pattern began taking shape. The deeper she looked, the more difficult it became to identify where the truth ended and the deception began. Every answer uncovered another lie. One person mentioned a business venture Jason had never discussed. Another referred to a relationship Emily had never heard about. A third recalled events that conflicted entirely with stories Jason had personally told her. The contradictions weren't isolated anymore. They were everywhere. And perhaps most troubling of all was the realization that Jason appeared remarkably skilled at maintaining different versions of himself depending on who he was speaking to. By this point, Emily was documenting everything. Names, dates, conversations, connections. What began as an effort to understand one relationship was evolving into something much larger. Months later, when investigators eventually reviewed the information, they would uncover patterns that extended far beyond Emily's personal experience. False identities, hidden relationships, financial deception, separate narratives carefully maintained among different groups of people. The image Jason Reed presented publicly and the reality investigators eventually uncovered were not the same thing. But at the time, Emily didn't know how extensive the situation truly was. She only knew something was very wrong. That was when Detective Megan Brooks entered the story. Initially, her involvement had nothing to do with romance, nothing to do with betrayal, and nothing to do with the emotional damage Emily was experiencing. Detective Brooks became interested because certain information connected to Jason began appearing within a broader inquiry involving financial irregularities and complaints that authorities could no longer ignore. What started as separate concerns slowly began overlapping. Records connected, names reappeared, timelines intersected, and as investigators examined those connections, the scope of the situation expanded rapidly. Meanwhile, the personal fallout surrounding Emily and Jason became impossible to contain. Friends who once admired the relationship found themselves taking sides. Some refused to believe the allegations and defended Jason aggressively. Others became convinced there was much more to the story than anyone initially realized. Families argued. Relationships became strained. Rumors spread through social circles faster than facts. The uncertainty created an atmosphere where nobody knew exactly what to believe anymore. For Emily, however, the rumors were secondary. She wasn't interested in gossip. She wanted the truth. The complete truth. Not just about another woman. Not just about a few lies. About everything. And so she continued digging. Continued documenting. Continued asking questions. With every new discovery, the picture became more alarming. Yet even then, Emily had no idea how close she was to uncovering something that would change the entire direction of the story. Because just as she believed she was finally beginning to understand what Jason Reed had been hiding, something happened. Something nobody expected. Something that transformed private suspicions into a matter investigators could no longer ignore. And almost overnight, the person Emily trusted most suddenly became the focus of an investigation. As Detective Megan Brooks and her team continued examining the growing collection of records, interviews, timelines, and complaints connected to Jason Reed, a disturbing reality began to emerge. At first, investigators believed they were looking at a relatively straightforward case involving dishonesty within a relationship. But the deeper they looked, the more obvious it became that the situation extended far beyond Emily Parker's experience. The evidence revealed a pattern, not a single deception, not a single victim, a pattern, names that appeared in different places, stories repeated to different people, promises made to multiple individuals, timelines that overlapped in ways that should have been impossible. The image Jason Reed had spent years presenting to the world began falling apart piece by piece. To friends, he was successful. To colleagues, he was trustworthy. To Emily, he was the man who seemed to arrive exactly when she needed someone most. But investigators discovered that each version of Jason had been carefully constructed. Different people knew different stories. Different people received different explanations. Different people believed they were seeing the real Jason Reed. In reality, very few people had ever seen the complete picture. The discovery shocked even seasoned investigators. Because maintaining one false image is difficult. Maintaining multiple versions of yourself simultaneously requires a level of planning most people never imagine. As Detective Megan Brooks reconstructed the timeline, a clearer pattern emerged. Relationships overlapped. Stories changed depending on the audience. Financial activities connected to those relationships raised additional questions. Promises were made. Trust was established. Then those relationships often followed remarkably similar paths. The details varied. The pattern did not. For Emily Parker, the most painful realization was still ahead. Throughout the investigation, part of her continued believing that her situation was unique, that somehow she had been singled out, that perhaps the connection she shared with Jason had once been genuine before everything went wrong. Then investigators showed her information she had never seen before. Additional timelines, additional names, additional relationships, and suddenly the reality became impossible to ignore. Emily was never the only target. The same methods appeared repeatedly, the same charm, the same carefully crafted image, the same promises, the same emotional investment, the same outcome. For the first time since the investigation began, Emily stopped asking why Jason had lied to her. Instead, she started asking a far more difficult question. Had any of it been real? The answer devastated her, because the evidence pointed toward a conclusion she had spent months trying to avoid. Love was never the objective. The deception was. That realization changed everything. The relationship she remembered, the conversations she treasured, the plans she believed in, the future she imagined. Every memory now carried a different meaning. What once felt like evidence of genuine affection now appeared as part of a larger pattern investigators had documented repeatedly. As more information became public, additional individuals came forward. Some shared experiences strikingly similar to Emily's. Others provided records, communications, and details that strengthened the investigation. Each new account added another piece to the puzzle. Each new revelation made the overall picture clearer. Court proceedings soon followed. Inside the courtroom, Detective Megan Brooks carefully explained how investigators connected the evidence. Timelines were presented. Records were examined. Testimony revealed how the carefully maintained image Jason Reed projected differed from what investigators eventually uncovered. For many observers, the proceedings were difficult to watch. Families struggled with conflicting emotions. Some felt anger. Others felt disbelief. Many simply struggled to understand how someone could maintain such a convincing facade for so long. The emotional impact spread far beyond the individuals directly involved. Trust was damaged. Relationships were tested. Entire social circles found themselves reevaluating assumptions they once considered unquestionable. For Emily Parker, however, the most difficult moment wasn't hearing investigators explain the evidence. It wasn't reading the records, and it wasn't even learning how many people had been affected. The hardest moment came when she finally accepted the truth. Not the legal truth, the personal truth. The realization that the person she trusted most had never been the person she believed he was. And that realization carried a weight no courtroom could fully measure. Looking back, Emily would eventually understand something that many people only recognize after painful experience. The warning signs had always existed. The inconsistencies, the unanswered questions, the changing stories, the unexplained absences. The details were there from the beginning. But they never appeared dangerous. They appeared hopeful. They appeared exciting. They appeared comforting. They appeared like exactly what she wanted to believe. The tragedy wasn't that the warning signs didn't exist. The tragedy was that they looked like love. Stories like this force us to ask difficult questions. Not because the answers are easy, but because the answers challenge assumptions most of us carry throughout our lives. How well do we really know the people we trust? It's a question that feels simple when everything is going well. It feels simple when promises are being kept, when conversations feel genuine, when someone consistently tells us exactly what we hope to hear. But stories like Emily Parker's remind us that trust is often built long before it is tested. And sometimes, by the time that test arrives, our belief in another person has become strong enough to silence doubts we might otherwise have listened to. As the investigation faded from public attention and the legal proceedings became part of the past, Emily found herself confronting a reality that many people spend years trying to understand. The hardest part wasn't the lies. It wasn't the deception. And it wasn't even the realization that Jason Reed had carefully constructed an image that wasn't real. The hardest part was accepting that she had believed in that image completely. Because belief changes how we interpret the world. It influences what we notice, what we dismiss, what we forgive, and what we choose to ignore. Looking back, Emily could identify moments that once seemed insignificant, questions she never fully pursued, explanations she accepted without challenge, details that felt slightly wrong but never wrong enough to outweigh the trust she had already given Jason. Like many people, she wasn't ignoring reality. She was interpreting reality through hope. Hope that this relationship was different. Hope that this person was different. Hope that after years of disappointment, she had finally found what she had been searching for. And perhaps that's why this story resonates with so many people. Because it isn't really about Jason Reed. It's about the universal desire to believe. To believe that someone is who they say they are. To believe that trust is deserved. To believe that the future we imagine is possible. Which brings us back to the message that started everything. The text Emily Parker sent to her sister on the night she disappeared from the lives of so many people who cared about her. 6 simple words. I finally found someone who cares. At the time, those words felt like the beginning of a happier chapter. A sign that difficult years were finally behind her. A sign that she had found the connection she had hoped for. A sign that she was moving toward something better. She thought she had. That is what makes those words so heartbreaking in hindsight. Because they weren't written by someone who felt afraid. They were written by someone who felt hopeful. Someone who believed she was making the right choice. Someone who believed she was finally safe enough to trust again. And in the end, that may be the most important lesson hidden within this story. The greatest deceptions rarely arrive disguised as danger. They arrive disguised as opportunity, as comfort, as understanding, as exactly what we want to believe. Sometimes the most dangerous lies are wrapped in exactly what we want to believe. So here's the question. If you were Emily Parker, would you have noticed the warning signs? Would the unexplained absences have made you suspicious? Would the changing stories have caught your attention sooner? Would the late-night phone calls, the vague answers about the past, and the inconsistencies in Jason Reed's explanations have been enough to make you start asking difficult questions? Or would you have done exactly what Emily did? Would you have trusted him? Because that's what makes stories like this so complicated. It's easy to identify warning signs after the truth has already been revealed. It's easy to connect the dots once you know where they lead. But when you're living through those moments in real time, things rarely seem so obvious. Trust has a way of changing how we interpret uncertainty. Hope has a way of convincing us that explanations make sense. And emotions have a way of encouraging us to see the version of reality we want to believe. That's why so many people continue debating stories like this long after they're over. Not because the facts are difficult to understand, but because many of us can imagine ourselves making the same decisions. So let me know what you think in the comments. If you were in Emily Parker's position, at what moment would you have started questioning Jason Reed? Would it have been the phone call, the unexplained trip, the photograph? Or would you have continued trusting him just a little longer? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoy stories where one discovery changes everything, where hidden truths slowly come to light, and where a single decision can change the course of someone's life forever, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Because if you think this story was shocking, wait until you hear about the woman who spent 7 years married to a man whose real identity didn't exist. What she discovered would force everyone around her to question whether they ever truly knew him at all.